Hello, college football fans. Welcome to episode 104 of College Football Throwdown. I'm your co-host, Alex Schmitz, and today I'm joined, as always, by my dad, Peter Schmitz.
Hello, college football fans and Nebraska Cornhusker fans.
Hello, everybody. It's been a little while since our last podcast. We did one back in June when we were together in Traverse City visiting each other. And we've both been pretty busy since then, but we're here back to give you a double episode special where we'll be doing one focusing on some of the big national topics that have happened since then. Just a few, minor things have occurred since we last did a podcast. And then another follow-up podcast that'll focus more on our team, the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and the upcoming season that's only a week away. How about that?
I am ready.
Me too. All right. And to kick us off, Dad, I believe you have a beverage for us.
I do. Today I was introduced to a local beer here in Traverse City. We have a brew pub here in town called North Peak Brewing Company, and they make a product, a cherry summer wheat. So it's a little bit like the Sam Adams, only made locally here, and of course using Traverse City cherries, which we are the cherry capital of the world. So it's kind of neat. It's called Archangel, and it's a cherry summer wheat. It's a nice, refreshing beer, good summer beer, really. So one I'm kind of looking forward to. They describe it as Michigan cherries, crisp and clean. So that's what I'm going to give it a go here. So, there we go. I'm ready.
All right.
It's fine. If someone ever comes up to Traverse City, they should check out North Peak Brew Pub.
Yeah, they've got some good stuff for sure. All right. Oh, Dad sounds like he's happy.
What I'm thinking of is their Monte Cristo sandwich, which is one of my favorite things on their menu.
Nice. Okay. So on the last podcast, we had actually discussed, as a kind of a teaser for next time, that we were going to talk more about athletes sitting out of bowl games, because that was kind of a topic on our minds as we were just finishing talking about the national championship game and some of the stuff that had happened since then. But little did we know that just about a month later, in late July, there would be quite a storm to hit college football, where 1 week, there's this little rumor that suddenly starts going around that Texas and Oklahoma might be leaving the Big 12 to join the SEC. And it's like, what? That's crazy talk. And then literally a week later, they've formally expressed their interest in the SEC to join the conference. It was pretty amazing how fast that happened and how under wraps Texas and Oklahoma had managed to keep that secret for so long, because they'd been in negotiations for months by that point.
Right. It really is. And it's kind of surprising, number one, that they were doing that, during this period of COVID, where there's been so much upheaval and, of course, losses in revenue and things of that nature for athletic departments across the board. But it's actually very savvy, I feel, of those two programs to have put themselves in that position, because they knew that they were effectively the two main, torchbearers, if you will, of the Big 12, and they could walk into any conference and their name and reputation would carry with it the kind of panache necessary to guarantee that them being added to a conference enhances that conference's portfolio and allows everyone to benefit money-wise. Okay. That's not true for pretty much all the rest of the Big 12 schools, right? They can't go to any of the other major conferences and everyone would say, oh, it's obvious that team will add more value than what we're getting paid per team right now. So by adding them to my conference, it enhances our potential for revenue.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And you saw that, I remember particularly like the Oklahoma State athletic director or president, they were definitely making a fuss of like, oh, this is going to affect our rivalry with Oklahoma, and this is really sneaking up on us, and da 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 da. So you could tell like the other schools were like scrambling.
Oh yeah, well, and they will be. I mean, now they're trying to figure it out, right? Like, can they survive as a Power Five conference without Texas and Oklahoma, and be viewed as a peer among the the higher level teams now that you or not teams but conferences like the SEC, Big Ten, and then Pac-12 and ACC, and even those other three that I mentioned after SEC. With the SEC doing what they did, the shot across the bow has occurred. So now they got to figure out what they're going to do. And now no one's safe, right?
Right.
There's going to be some more cannibalizing going on here, I think, or they're going to have to come up with an alternative.
Oh yeah. Well, back when realignment was going on, when like Nebraska was leaving the Big 12, and there was a lot of chaos at the time, and Texas nearly left the Big 12 themselves before ESPN enticed them with the Longhorn Network to stay. But at the time there were these talk of like these super conferences, like 16 team huge conferences. That's the way things were going. It didn't quite turn out that way, but it feels like it might kind of finally be coming now, because the SEC will be a big 16 team super conference, and now it's the question of how do the other conferences respond now.
Well, exactly, and there is indications or rumor that the SEC's not done, that they are visualizing a conference that maybe is upwards into the 20s, right? That they wouldn't be opposed to going out and getting another 4 or 6 teams, and then having so much leverage with the TV networks that they get a vast chunk of the money, right? So if you start to look at yourself and say, this is a national conference, it's no longer just about the Southeast, right? So maybe I can cherry pick 4 more schools that are premier, like go into the ACC and take Clemson and Florida State and Miami out of there, and maybe grab Ohio State and Penn State from the Big Ten, or go or Notre Dame, right? Because if you take the guts out of the ACC, then all of a sudden Notre Dame is no longer interested in their close relationship with the ACC. So a lot of dominoes could start to fall based on what the SEC does next, or are they now done? And that's the big question. And the fact that the other conferences have caught pretty much flat-footed on this is kind of an indictment of their leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It was definitely a savvy move on the SEC side of things. And at first, when I was hearing about it, it made sense for me about Oklahoma leaving. That seemed to make sense. But for Texas, they got such a cushy deal, to help keep the Big 12 together, being the top dog and all that, and having the Longhorn Network, and getting the Lions the bigger share of like the Big 12 pot, more so than anybody else, even though they haven't had much great success on the field, in the last decade or so. It felt like they had a pretty good gig there. But from what I was saying, it turned out that even with that money that they're getting from Longhorn Network and stuff, the money they'd be getting at this new SEC with 16 teams would be even greater. And so, that's really what it's all about at the end of the day.
Right. That and the stability, right? That the SEC, represents to them in terms of making sure that you're not caught on the outside looking in. Because the Big 12 has always been unstable ever since, the changes happened when Missouri and Colorado and us and A&M all left. I mean, it was from the get-go a shell of its former self. So there's been instability ever since then. And there was no way they were going to keep up with the Joneses as the SEC, gets a new deal. And the Big Ten also negotiated a fairly short time frame for their television contract in the hopes that they would have a chance to reopen and enter into discussions again. fairly soon, and we're the next domino to fall. The Big Ten is.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as contracts expiring, so the Big Ten's got to figure out what it's going to do, and so to keep up with the SEC, I think you and I have talked a little bit before the podcast here about what are the choices, right? What are the things to do? One is to do nothing and just stand pat and kind of let the SEC go do its thing. Because the reality is, I'm not sure it will end up being a good thing for Texas or Oklahoma athletics in terms of their national relevance. It may put more money in their coffers. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But will they be more relevant as a sports program?
Yep.
Because when they have to now compete in a conference or division or whatever, where they're having to fight, with Alabama, Florida, Auburn, Tennessee, you name all the big powers, Georgia of the SEC, all of a sudden Oklahoma's path to, undefeated season or a one-loss season is much, much more difficult. And all of a sudden Oklahoma's going to have to start getting used to, a lot of seasons in which they have 3 losses, not 1.
Right. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of factors playing into those decisions, one of which is recruiting, because as I was listening to a lot of the pundits talking about this, a lot of them were mentioning how A&M, since they're moved to the SEC, they've actually been out recruiting their old buddy Texas.
Right.
And obviously, Texas's poor performance on the field, certainly isn't helping them, but also being able to say, hey, you're in the SEC, you get to play in the best conference in college football is a big selling point for recruits. And then also, another thing I saw, which was done by ESPN, they actually mentioned Nebraska, saying, Nebraska's move to the Big Ten hasn't been good for them on the football field, but financially it's been great for them, and they got out of the Big 12 early, kind of praising Nebraska's foresight in that regard.
Right.
So
we would really think about it. If we were still part of the Big 12 and had the struggles that we've had, maybe not, we wouldn't have it to that extent because we wouldn't have been playing in the Big Ten and our win-loss record would be better, but we would not have been winning conference championships or been in a national discussion. We might not have sucked as bad because we would have had easier games to play, frankly, but we still wouldn't have been very good. And now imagine us, that far removed from the Tom Osborne influence, where would we be attractive to the Big Ten right now? Nope, we wouldn't. So it's a damn good thing that we moved when we did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just that we're not getting caught flat-footed like all these other Big 12 schools are.
Right. So here's the thing. Have you put any thought or read some of the scenarios that people have talked about? Like I said, the one is the opportunity to do nothing and just stand pat, right? But then there's also some other issues or options like do you go out and get 2 programs just like the SEC did and go get the 16? Well, if the Big Ten is going to do that, they need to pick 2 schools that can bring enough credibility that they, add to the pool, right? They can't subtract from the pool. And there's just not a lot of schools that could do that, right? And are you going to destabilize one of the other major conferences? Because you're not going to find that in independence except for Notre Dame, who's already very closely tied to the ACC, or who else do you got, right? That's an independent. Right. Some might say like a BYU, but they don't bring that credibility. So now you're talking about going out to the Pac-12 and maybe enticing some of the AAU schools out in the Pac-12, like USC, UCLA, Washington, Arizona, some of those kinds of schools that are AAU members, and Stanford, So now you've destabilized and broken up the Pac-12, right? And what if the Pac-12 then goes and cannibalizes the rest of the Big 12 and takes 3 or 4 teams from that to get themselves to 16, which they could do,
right?
Right.
Well, in terms of my predictions, the one thing I am confident in is that the Big 12 will not survive. I think it will be gobbled up it'll either be gobbled up by the bigger leagues or it will become its own, like not one of the Power Five, be a smaller, less renowned conference. Because you're right, without Oklahoma and Texas there, you've got some programs with history like Kansas, obviously they're great in basketball, and Iowa State's been doing well recently with their new coach, and so you've got some other teams in that mix, but none of them have the kind of star power that Texas Oklahoma did. So I can't believe they'll survive with their same level of prestige on their own.
Right. They don't have the TV eyeballs to draw that kind of an interest from any of the majors. And so other than, like you say, maybe a Kansas is an AAU school and it has a premier basketball program. But again, all these changes generally have to do with football revenue, because basketball revenue is still the cash cow of the NCAA. Now, there might be some longer term plans that are underway here by the SEC, recognizing that the destabilized NCAA suggests that maybe the SEC is thinking, you know what, we're going to enter into our own separate agreement. We're going to just go completely around the NCAA, and we're going to create a new NCAA, for lack of a better term, right? A new governing body that's going to oversee just the big boys,
right?
And so this idea, which goes back to the original concept of the super conference, the idea that you'd have 4 super conferences of 16 teams, and there's your 64, right? So you take the top 64 Division I football programs effectively, and include them all in their own division, and then you go from there.
Right.
But now there's all kinds of scenarios, right? I don't know if we end up with 4 or if we end up with even less than 4, and we end up with 3, like with 24 teams.
Right. Well, yeah, it was surprising to hear the number of pundits at the time that were saying, like, yeah, this could be, I think this is the end of the NCAA, and they were just kind of saying it kind of casually, like that. It's just going to happen.
It definitely, right. It definitely destabilizes, because it's like when you get to a certain point, then these conferences have so much control and panache that they can tell the NCAA to do whatever they want them to do. Right. I mean, it's so, and the problem, and the whole purpose of the NCAA was to stabilize things and distribute money so that some of these lesser schools, and I'm using that term lightly because it varies in definition depending on the sport, right? But obviously the big drivers are football and basketball, and football is outside of the NCAA already. And so then it's just, the other stuff. So.
Right. And that leads us nicely into 2 other elements of this larger conference realignment storyline. One is that there have been rumors here recently, we're recording this here in late August, that the Big Ten, Pac-12, and ACC may be forming some sort of alliance that will be announced pretty soon. The details on it seem to be very in flux as of right now, but some sort of kind of partnership between the conferences to combat the power of the SEC, and notably the Big 12 isn't included on that list because they don't have that kind of influence without those 2.
And those individual institutions now are kind of caught in no man's land, right? But here's the thing with that alliance. That alliance, or an alliance very similar to that, was announced in the immediate aftermath of the last movement within the conferences. The expansion, when Nebraska joined the Big Ten and A&M went to the SEC and Colorado went to the Pac-12. All that, once that kind of all happened, then because of the long-standing relationship between the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and the Rose Bowl, we entered into an alliance, and it had all these arrangements that we were going to all play at least one, premier matchup between a Pac-12 school and a Big 12 school in football and stuff. So they announced this, okay, and it was going to happen. And then, like literally within a year, it was quietly dissolved. It didn't happen. And the problem is that, I just don't know whether TV partners are going to pony up real big dollars, okay, like they would when they're talking with one entity, which would be one conference, right? They're just not going to do it. And so the idea in concept is, well, we can have an alliance that creates a significant number of very desirable games. Michigan, USC, Stanford against Ohio State, Washington against Nebraska, Penn State, blah blah blah. You get the point, right? All these big name matchups. So we could get into a thing like that, where then if we're negotiating with a contract, a television contract entity, whether that's an Amazon Prime now, or it's the traditional ones like ESPN or Fox or whatever. I mean, you can say, well, I can bring this product to the table and then distribute the money. And all that does is then now how do you distribute it between the Big Ten and the Pac-12? Because right now the Big Ten's way more lucrative than the Pac-12. So how does that all work, right? And how do they make that money? And how does that compare with the SEC's power to be able to say, these are our conference teams. We now have 16 of them, and boom, it's very simple, right? Do the math, divide it by 16, done, right? Mm-hmm. So I just think the alliance thing is a far weaker option, but it's much more desirable from the standpoint that it's a much less of a commitment. And their hope is that it would allow them then to make sure that the SEC doesn't gobble up all the spots that are optionable, so to speak, in any future playoff scenarios. Because that's the other big kicker, is the SEC is locking it down here as far as getting the big money from the conferences that get to participate in the now 4-team college football playoff.
Right. Well, man, there's so many directions we could keep going. Because I was going to say earlier when you were mentioning, Oklahoma and Texas shifting to the SEC and how that might affect their performance, I think part of Oklahoma's calculation was like, well, we've been doing great, getting into this 4-team playoff pretty much all the time in the Big 12. Right. But if they're going to expand it to 12, which is what's been talked about and proposed, right, then, even if we're second or third in the SEC, we could still get in, so that advantage of, being the best in the Big 12 isn't as important.
Right. And right. Except that there's something from a recruit standpoint, because what do recruits want? They want to play in the big venues. They want to be on TV and get visibility and all that. They also want to be champions, right? And if you go into the SEC and you're Oklahoma, and all of a sudden, guess what? You're used to winning about every other championship in the Big 12, right? Like every other year, you're the football champion in that league, and you're getting the automatic bid to one of the premier things and stuff like that. You go into the SEC and it doesn't. The margin for error is so thin there that they could easily find themselves losing 3 games, right? All of a sudden they get a conference schedule that includes, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida all in the same year. And then they still have to play Texas because they're kind of partners in their side of the league or whatever. And wham, bam, all of a sudden, you go 1-3 in those 4 games, you've got 3 losses. You're not the second best team in the SEC at that point. You're tied for 5th. You know what I mean? And all of a sudden you're just another Oslo-ran. You're not quite as bad as Nebraska, but there ain't a lot of difference. Not in the perception side. You know what I mean? Now, granted, they still have the recruiting advantages. They still have access to the athletes. Blah blah blah. They're getting all the money, so their facilities and everything like that. So I know there's a lot of different aspects to that. But bottom line is, I'm not sure that leads to the promised land that they want.
Right. Well, and the other thing I was going to mention, because I know we've talked about this in the past on previous podcasts, like that when these big TV contracts get renegotiated, that, there's going to be kind of a come to Jesus moment because, so many people have been pulling the plug right on cable and
Right,
all that
right.
stuff, not as many people have cable TV, and so is the value of some of that stuff going to go down? And thusly, I guess, are the conferences kind of foreseeing that and trying to kind of consolidate their power, so that, like, they have the biggest, only, like you say, like the top 64, like, considered to be, part of this, like, main division, and then everybody else is kind of lesser, who doesn't have that TV money power, kind of gets left by the wayside. But then,
If you
but then,
if
how?
you're asking me, that is absolutely true. If you're asking for Pete's opinion, Dad's opinion, then I'm telling you, I believe a wise commissioner and his presidents are anticipating that that's a very real possibility, because this money cannot continue. And you're exactly right. With all the people that have cut the cords, the ESPNs of the world and the traditional broadcast partners do not have the money to give us even what we've already been getting. Okay, because the math just doesn't work. Okay, they have to come up with these other platforms, right? These other ways to create revenue streams. Otherwise, it's never going to work.
Right.
So,
Which is why I was going to bring up, like, ESPN Plus, and you mentioned Amazon earlier, and
exactly.
those sorts of things.
Yep.
I'm not aware of the numbers of that right now. Like, how many people who have cut the cord, have then subscribed to these other digital streaming services to
Right.
kind of offset that revenue loss,
Yep.
you know?
Yep. AT&T TV and YouTube channel. Right now, you can get all your broadcasting through them, and so then they're entering into relationships with ESPN and all that. And at the end of the day, the whole we cut our cord and we're saving money is gone, right? By the end of the day, people are still spending the same amount of money, only now it's a la carte. Well, there is the path where they can reestablish the revenue stream, right, and make their money. ESPN is having to go through the transition because right now they're what they call carriage fee, right, which is the fee they charge everybody who uses cable. Like
Mm-hmm.
if ESPN is on your cable list, your level of subscription, then you're paying that carriage fee whether you're a sports fan or not, right? So let's say we're talking about a place like New York City, right? Not a huge college city, not a college town, right?
Right.
Well, there's 10 million people. Okay, let's say there's 5 million cable subscribers. Well, what percentage of those are really heavy ESPN users? Well, let's say it's 50%. Well, that means there's 2.5 million people paying that carriage fee every month that don't really use it, but they're having to pay it anyway because it's on the base cable. Okay, now those are the people that have cut in the cord, because why would I want to pay that? Because ESPN alone is like $10 or $12 a month just for the ESPN family of channels.
Right.
They have a huge carriage fee. Well, guess what? The cable networks of the world, they're not going to agree to those numbers next time, because it isn't the value's not there, because they've lost all these subscribers. So that number's got to go down. Well, where's ESPN going to get the money that they lose from that? Where's that going to come from?
Mm-hmm.
So it's got to come from ESPN Plus and other creative methods and relationships that they have. Well, they can do that by cornering the market. If they could secure by doing what they've done with
Disney Plus.
Disney Plus but by encouraging the SEC, you've probably read the articles and stuff about the fact that right now the Big 12 has sued ESPN,
Oh, yes.
saying that they were tampering, right?
Yeah, that
because
they were working
now
behind the
now that
scenes.
ESPN is done, yeah, they want to see the Big 12 dissolve, because then they can walk away from those obligations and relationships, right? That's a bunch of money they owe those schools that they don't want to pay now, because they've lost their big guns there in Oklahoma and Texas, right? So ESPN's trying to get out of it,
Right.
because it's a loser now.
Yeah.
So
Well, and tying into that, the reports I've seen say that that Texas and Oklahoma, because they're scheduled to leave in 2025. But of course, the expectation for everybody is that they're going to try to leave before that. But they'll have to
Correct.
pay the Big 12 in order to do that.
Right.
And I believe the number was around 140 million between the two schools to pay the Big 12. But a lot of people have brought up that there's about 160 million left on that Longhorn Network contract between Texas and ESPN. And so could
Right.
they kind of, cancel that contract,
Trade.
get that money
Mm-hmm.
now, and, try to pay out that exit fee and be in the SEC potentially by next year.
Right. Exactly. And I think and or if the Big 12 begins to destabilize to the point where it's no longer in other schools end up opting and trying to find a landing spot, if you will. If, for example, if Kansas, who I know is having conversations with the Big 10 now, because they would be one of a small number of possible additions that the Big 10 might be willing to consider because they fit the profile of institutionally. Kansas, what if Kansas bailed? Now you're down to even fewer schools, and one of those kind of on the margins major like Kansas that has a premier historic basketball program and has had periods in its history where their football was pretty good too. That's a school you could take a risk on. Baylor's recent success maybe makes them attractive if you're the Pac-12, let's say, and you're looking to do an expansion. So there's all kinds of scenarios that open up there, and now the Big 12 is completely gone, right? It's like now it's no longer a legitimate conference, and those contracts can then be abandoned by ESPN. I mean, they have a legitimate commercial justification to say, hey, these are no longer void
and
or no longer valid.
And Texas and Oklahoma, so that's probably what they're secretly hoping for.
Yeah, so they want it to destabilize and fall apart.
Right.
And now that's what the Big 12 is suing them over, because they think they have documentation, emails, etc., proving that ESPN was kind of encouraging this path.
Yep.
But here's the scenario. A scenario in which we either go after some of the ACC schools that are premier, like Clemson, Florida State, or Miami, or I think even Syracuse. I think Syracuse might be an AAU school, but some of these schools that have both a good academic history and, like a North Carolina, and some either great football or good football and great basketball type of things, and entice those schools to join the Big 10 in a pursuit, in a big bold move to go from our current 14 to like 20. And we add 6 schools, which would include like Clemson, Notre Dame, the Pac-12 schools that I talked about, USC, Stanford, all that. So then we would put together a combination that would allow somebody like Notre Dame to say, yeah, I can now join that conference because now all my traditional rivals, my traditional games that we value as an institution, Notre Dame, Stanford, Notre Dame, USC, that sort of thing, all those are available to us. Okay, now we can talk, right? Now this is legit. And we end up, the Big 10 ends up going to 20 teams or 22 or something like that. Right. And the SEC would quickly follow and do the same. And now all these remaining institutions are kind of the lesser schools of those major conferences. And now they've got to scramble to formulate a third conference. And then you're pretty much done. Then this just scraps.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about
it's crazy.
In terms of, like the big schools that are kind of left out there, it'd be like Oregon, USC, Notre Dame, Clemson, Miami, Florida State, Washington,
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. And
because they have to have the combination of, a premier athletics, particularly football, and they have to be academically attractive, right? That they're institutions that have a sufficient credibility academically to be attractive to a conference like the Big Ten or the Pac-12 or whatever. But now you've destabilized the Pac-12, so then you end up with the remnants of the Pac-12 and the Big Eight or Big 12 coming together and making some third conference that's a bunch of really good schools, but no major like
Right.
frontline schools.
Right. A lot of mid-tier schools, kind of.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and what was I going to say? I can't help but feel like, the ACC and the SEC might have been smart in their naming strategy, because they can just still be the SEC, and they don't have to deal with
right.
the silliness of
A
like
number.
the Big Ten being the Big Ten, even if they've got 20 schools or something like
Right,
that.
right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's why the Big's logo is basically a big.
Yep.
And wouldn't it be appropriate that we would be big, like 20 schools or
Right.
24 schools?
And
And again, this all plays into what is the future of the NCAA, which you brought up
yes.
earlier.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to mention that I think the Big Ten is the next. That's kind of like their move, because they're definitely the second most powerful conference in terms of money and influence right
Yep.
now. So yeah, I'll be interested to see how that goes. But going into the
Yeah.
NCAA side of things, they not too long after all this craziness with Oklahoma and Texas, they announced that there would be an NCAA Constitution Committee formed to basically come up with some proposals to change the constitution of the NCAA. So this is some, we're going back to the basics here, and it's not something that's been called for very often. But that committee has already been formed. Apparently, they're supposed to submit proposals in November to like the board of the NCAA, that then those proposals will then go to this convention of like all the conferences, all the big teams. That's going to happen in January. So
Right.
basically there is some big change on the horizon. And a lot of it depends on how does this conference realignment go? Do these plans of the 12 team playoff that had been being discussed and proposed at the NCAA, does that kind of go away now, and they come up with some sort of new plan if there's going to be like 3 or 4 super conferences instead of the 5 Power 5 conferences like we were expecting, so there's definitely a lot of change on the horizon, I think.
Well, and to me, all that is precursor, okay? Because it's all going to come down to money, and lawyers are going to be the deal. Okay, lots of lawsuits are going to get filed here, because what really, you can have all those conversations about constitutional convention, changes and stuff, but if you present it to a vote, constitutional change would require a vote of all the member institutions. Well, all the small schools are going to band together and vote no, right? Because they're getting squeezed out. I mean, at the end of the day, the big boys are saying, we want our money and we want it now, and we want to protect our rights because we're the real money makers here. We're the thing that brings the eyeballs. So give them to us, give us the money or not. What's going to happen to the NCAA is exactly what happened, what Texas did to the Big 12. Right? What did Texas and Oklahoma do to the Big 12? They basically went to the other institutions that were part of the Big 12 and said, you guys are going to have to pony up a little more money to bring it our way. Let us have these third tier rights to ourselves and stuff. So we have a built-in competitive advantage to you financially, so we can keep you down and we can be the big boys in perpetuity. Okay, that's what they set up. That's the arrangement. It was not equal. Okay, and of course, the ultimately, when it looked like the Big 12 was going to dissolve, what did those other institutions do? They capitulated, right? They said yes. They allowed it, right? And that uneven distribution occurred, and has been occurring. So that's what's going to happen to the NCAA. I mean, the big boys they're going to have all this discussion, and there's going to be all this hand moving and gestures and all this nice talk. But at the end of the day, if the big boys don't get what they want, they're going to say, well, then we'll just take our ball and go home. We're going to create a new we're going to create a new organization. We're going to do our own thing, because one way or another, we're going to get paid what we're worth, because we have to do that, because now there's NIL and we got to figure out how we can pay all these athletes, and we got to stay competitive and blah blah blah. You follow me?
Oh yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
another aspect of this whole deal with the NCAA is that there was a Supreme Court case, which I believe we might have mentioned on a previous podcast, but the decision for that came down here in the summer. And what was interesting was that the athletes who had brought the case, I believe, in the intervening from going from like the district court to the appeals court or to the Supreme Court or whatever, they had actually dropped their kind of accusation about like not paying players, the NCAA. So that wasn't on the table for discussion. It was specifically about the NCAA limiting how many like educational benefits schools could give to students, like awarding scholarships or grants and things of that nature. And the NCAA lost. So, those additional educational and grants, are permitted to be awarded to students. But it was also, there was plenty of language in the opinion. And I remember, I think it was Justice Brett Kavanaugh specifically made several notes that they found the NCAA's general arguments about like paying students and keeping it, that basically that they're
amateur,
right? That keeping college football amateur was part of their brand, and that's what people value about the NCAA. And the Supreme Court made it clear that they don't, they look a little askance at that argument.
that.
So that there's going to be more lawsuits come the NCAA's way. So between that and
Absolutely.
the name, image, and likeness stuff going through, and then now this conference realignment stuff, they are on as unsteady a footing as I've ever seen for the NCAA.
I agree. And so I think the conferences are making all these moves, try to position themselves to when all this shit hits the fan, and whether it's at a constitutional convention or it's just because of the independent moves that the conferences make, that those conferences, when the dust settles, are the ones in control of their own destiny, right? That's what they want. And so I'm leery of anything other than conference expansion, because that's the known entity. We expand, we have control of these teams. We now, are able to control that product, and therefore the revenue opportunities that are available to us through that product. These discussions about alliances and some kind of an agreement between conferences, to me, until I witness somebody like Fox or ESPN or some other major broadcasting entity embracing that and saying, yes, I'm going to pay the same amount of money for that, for you saying that USC is going to play Michigan and Washington's going to play Ohio State, annually or whatever, and we're going to get all this wonderful product in our mix, and I'm going to pay you the same as if you guys were all in one conference. If that's not happening, that ain't going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I'm curious. Let's put your betting hat on here. Between the NCAA stays together in some form or another with these super conferences as its like main, as its Division I like main makeup. That's right. Option one. Or option two, NCAA falls apart and everybody kind of goes their separate ways in terms of like making their own TV contracts and, come to some sort of agreement about a national championship game or whatever. Which of the two do you think is more likely at this stage?
Well, if I had to bet on it today, I would bet on the latter, your second option. I don't think the NCAA is going to be able to hold that together because, again, unless all these discussions involve the fact that these guys who run the NCAA, you guys all no longer have a job, and the people that are going to replace you, they're going to get paid like a fourth or a tenth of what you get paid, because Emirates, the guy who runs the NCAA right now, gets paid a stupid amount of money, okay, like millions of dollars a year, and you can make the argument, well, that's a very big organization and it has a lot of people and they're doing a lot of things and they're putting on all these NCAA championships and blah, 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 blah. It's like, you know what? Tough. You can't pay somebody that much money and then have his executive team, the number of people in that executive group that get paid more than $1 million is crazy. And so all that money could be in the hands of these conferences. See, and that's the way they look at it,
Right.
I think. So at the end of the day, I think they've built this monster they can't sustain, and it's going to come crashing down. And when it does, a new organization, not the NCAA, will be created to oversee, Olympic sport athletics and things of that nature. But the big games, i.e., football and probably collegiate basketball, are going to have a separate entity that runs their groups. And so conferences and individual institutions are going to end up signing up for these new entities that oversee those certain sports, and there'll be some competing interests, but eventually it'll all settle out, and there'll be one or two groups that do that. Yeah, but they'll just be defined differently, and the haves and the have-nots will be separate.
Yeah. For me personally, I think it's kind of at least, and I'll admit I don't have the most information in the world, but I think it's kind of like a 50-50 toss up. Like, will we have the NCAA, 3 years from now? I don't know, honestly. It's
okay. That's weak, man. I'm not accepting that. You got to make your call. So you asked me to make my call.
I mean, if you're forcing me to make a call in the long run, I don't know how long it'll take, but in the long run, I would also lean towards the NCAA being gone. I don't know how long it will take, but it seems unsustainable. The one thing I was thinking about, because you brought up earlier, how the if it came to like a vote at this NCAA convention, right, all the small schools would vote against some of these motions because it's not in their interest. And then the, big boys will say, well, we'll take our ball and go home then. But then where do the politicians get involved at those smaller schools?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And that's what I meant when I said then the lawsuits, and you're right. The politicians will get involved at that point.
Right. So yeah, it's going to be crazy. But last thing we'll talk about here is that good old 12-team playoff, because you'll recall that when I was back in Traverse City in June, we actually talked about it a bit while we were kayaking together out on the lake. It was a very nice day.
It was.
And obviously, as we've said, some of this plan, this committee that like came up with this proposal for a 12-team playoff was all before all this conference realignment talk started happening. So who knows how they'll throw a wrench into things. But the general understanding of it was that it would be 6 conference champions would be automatically invited based off of their ranking in the top 25 rank. And then there would be 6 at-large bids, essentially. And obviously, this would serve the effect of, opening it up significantly where it's been very difficult to get in, and even amongst the Power 5, right, with only 4 teams able to be in the playoff, one is always left out, feeling kind of sour about it afterwards. And this also gives, at least with our old perspective of like, if we think of the 5 power conference champions getting in, and then that means there's basically always going to be one from the group of 5, who's able to get in as well, whoever's the highest ranked. So, from a lot of perspectives, that makes a lot of sense. Personally, I was kind of thinking more of an 8-team expansion. I wasn't sure if 12 was maybe too big, after being with 4 for so long. Because I still I'm still trying to preserve the sanctity of the regular season, making like every win there still be important. Because with 12 teams, you'll definitely get a lot more 2 and 3 lost teams that still make it into that playoff. But what are kind of your thoughts on the general idea, and then how that has changed since all this conference talk began?
Right. Okay. So I would say that, in the early days, even before the college football playoff existed, I would have told you that I wanted nothing to do with that expansion. Now, I'm very much in favor of it because I think the 4-team is a disaster from the standpoint of the long-term viability of a competitive landscape for college football. So I am all about getting more teams involved, and especially one that guaranteed
that conference champions were all going to be a part of it, regardless of their record. Like it was an automatic, a little bit like winning a conference in basketball for the NCAA tournament is, right? That would, to me, would be a very important characteristic. It would also be important to me that no one conference, even if you can quote quote make the argument that that team deserves to be in there more than this other team, that you would not allow one conference to end up, basically consuming beyond a certain number of the bids, right? The at larges or whatever, so that you don't have that kind of exclusivity where the reputation of the conference and the teams themselves dictates or presupposes who's going to be chosen. You know what I'm so
was that
specifically
actually
to stop the SEC from basically taking the incredible leverage that they've now been able to establish with this 14 playoff and just extend it to 12 teams.
right? Well, now, what you just said about there being like a limit on how many teams could come per conference, was that part of this proposal? Or is that something you want added?
No, you're just saying, yeah. You were asking me what I thought. I would say I would be in favor of the expansion, and I would go beyond the 8. I'd go to the 12, because the other thing that does is that creates more football games, so that's more revenue for this entity of a college football playoff, and it would allow more of the bowl games, particularly the higher, more highly regarded bowl games, to be a part of this playoff structure, and that increases the credibility and viability of the bowls and their existence, because frankly, in the college football playoff era, the traditional bowls have been relegated to an afterthought and are irrelevant if they're not part of the conference, or the college football playoff. They do not carry even a fraction of the weight that they used to carry. And so the more of those games that you can start making matter, the more that it helps level the playing field. Right now, I don't believe the playing field is level at all. I think the teams that are successful now are going to be able to leverage that reputation and status to sustain themselves at the top. And so you need that top tier to include more teams, so that there's more dynamic for movement. Right now, it's way too concentrated at the top.
Right.
It's a little bit like the lawsuit that was again just refiled by the Justice Department against Facebook. I mean, we've got a monopoly going on here, and we need to break it up.
Yeah. I should mention that one of the aspects of this 12-team proposal was that the top 4 seeds would get a bye in the first week. So you'd have eight teams play the first week, and then the winners of those games would play the top 4 seeded teams. Although interestingly, I think I read that like if Notre Dame as an independent was like ranked in the top 4, they would still have to play in the first round, because I guess they're not a part of that conference. They're not a conference champion, right? It's like the 4 top conference champions was how it was specified.
Yeah. See, and that's what, that's one of the quirky things about going with 12 versus going with
8.
8 or 16. And the problem with 16 is now you're dealing with quarterfinals there, right? So then you're talking about somebody that's got to play a game that takes you from game 1 is from 16 to 8, game 2 is 8 to 4, game 3 is 4 to 2, and then game 4. So those 2 teams that are playing for the championship are playing 4 playoff games in addition to whatever the regular season is. And if you have a 12-game regular season, now you're playing 16 games. That's a lot of football games for those athletes to be playing in a single year.
Right. And to your earlier point about the, kind of the rich getting richer, as it were, the teams that are at the top staying at the top. I will agree that like expanding it to 12 would kind of give the little guys, the other teams, like an opportunity to play those guys, and kind of like prove it on the field, right? And we might see some like exciting upsets in those sorts of scenarios and that kind of stuff. But with all of the changes we've been talking about, with the SEC consolidating its power, the name, image, and likeness stuff, and how teams can use that to, entice people to come to their schools and all that sort of thing. And, basically everything in college football going more towards money, money being the most important thing. I can't see how the Alabamas of the world don't just continue to consolidate their grip on college football, and the Clemsons and maybe Oklahoma might get disrupted, like we said. But
here's where I would hope it would happen. It would evolve into more of what it used to be back in the day, where if you were the Orange Bowl champion, okay, that was a big deal for you, and on the recruiting trail, your ability to go, say into the state of Florida and other southern hotbeds of recruiting, and recruit players because they knew that you were part of the Big Eight that was associated with the Orange Bowl. And in comparison to that, the Big Ten schools, and the recruiting hotbed of California, because they were going to be playing in the Rose Bowl, right? And so being relevant in those individual major bowl games was super central to both your national image and also your ability to recruit, okay? And that you were viewed as one of the upper echelons. They referred to them as blue bloods. Now, who are the blue bloods of today's college football? Basically there's about 6, you could maybe say 7 teams in that upper echelon, right? And everyone else is kind of at some tier below that. But there's only like 5 to 6 teams that you could say are that. And within that, there's really only 2 or 3 that are really there, which would be Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, and maybe in Oklahoma, because they've played in it so many times. But Oklahoma's yet to win one, right? They're yet to win a game in that scenario. So even they struggle a little bit in that argument of, relevant success. So if you all of a sudden expand that, I think all of a sudden you now have not just a group of 12, but in those games over the years, you're going to have 25 teams that regularly make an appearance. And so now you've got that blue blood group again. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Because that's important to creating credibility and enough diversity in that. Now, would Alabama still have a stranglehold on winning the championship? As long as they continue to have the kind of great recruiting and consistently great coaching that they get, yes, they're going to continue to be remarkably good year in and year out. But I think that there would be more teams that would be able to knock on the door. And if a couple of things happened, like NCAA investigations, criminal activity, bad press, whatever you want to call it, changeover in coaches that happen at those institutions, like a Clemson or an Alabama or an Ohio State, might knock them off their perch just a little bit and allow others the opportunity to seize that power gap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that part is certainly true, because we've seen that happen, in the aughts, it was like USC and Texas, right? Where played in so many national championships and seemed so good. And then, in this decade, this past decade, the 2010s, they've been pretty bad. That can happen.
It does. And historically, it has always happened. I mean, those who go up, come down kind of thing. But the problem is now that the disparity and the preeminence, because that group is so small, there's only 4, that gives them such an enormous leverage and advantage in the perception side of things and the recruiting side of things, that it's just a perpetuation of it. And so we need to broaden that. And so now I'm a believer in that. Now, how you do that and not destroy these kids' athletic futures by playing them in too many games. Because again, if you're a college football player, many of them, their aspiration is not to just be a great college football player. Their aspiration is to be a great college football player, champion, and then a big payday in the NFL, right? Well, they don't want to wear out their bodies just playing college football games, right? So you can't be playing 16 games a year if you're an Alabama football player and you're always in the finals. That's tough, which is why more and more of those kids leave after 2 years or 3 years.
Right.
As soon as they can, they're gone because they don't want to put the mileage on their bodies.
Yep. Yeah. And then I suppose if we go with this idea that, say, we're down to 4 conferences instead of the main 5. So now if we stick with the current rules, then there'd be, so you're saying instead of doing.
Well, I would say then 8 sounds like a really good number. If we only had 4 major conferences, I would say 8 sounds like a really good number. Then we get the 4 conference champions, and you got 4 at large. That includes, access for, the non-power 4, as well as the second best teams in the power 4 as a possibility, and maybe even the third best team in the power 4. If, one of the others, there's some flexibility in that. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Right. Versus, I suppose in the 12 team way, then you'd have 2 power, group of 5 champions in the mix, or you just change it to so there's only 5 conference champions, so they still only have 1, and then there's 7 at-larges, basically.
Right. Exactly. So, there's no easy answer to this. This gets really complicated. And again, it all rolls back into, are we really talking about, 125 teams that are on a comparable scale? Or do we need to divide this into, 2 divisions, let's say, where the top 64 or 72 or 84 teams are considered Division I, and everybody after that, you are at the next level.
Right. Yeah. That we'll have to see. We'll have to see what ends up being decided.
I'm going to tell you, it's going to spiral into a lot of ugliness, a lot of lawsuits, a lot of politicians threatening shit. That's going to not be healthy or good for college sports. And I'm just hopeful that when all the dust settles, that the team that we follow and support, is in the mix with the big boys to continue what we've enjoyed and loved to watch, which is, high level collegiate sports. But we'll see.
Yep.
I'm not sure.
Yep. The aspects of tradition and it being amateur sport and all that sort of stuff, all that stuff is kind of fading away now, not totally, obviously. Obviously tradition is still important at all these schools, but what have you done for me lately and money are definitely the 2 most important things. So it is kind of sad to see that, but college football will survive definitely in some form or another. And our hope is that Nebraska's hanging in there with the big boys, like you just said.
Right.
Yeah.
And it allows us to maybe, take advantage of that. The NIL, although it's not going to be a slam dunk, there is an opportunity for Nebraska to leverage the rabidness of their fan base and the commitment that they have to their college, and really make us more attractive again in a way that maybe some of the people around us, our competitors, can't.
Yeah, that's
that would be a good thing.
Yeah, that's very true. So if you all out there enjoyed listening to us, you can email us at huskerpete13@gmail.com. You could also find us on Apple Podcasts if you search for College Football Throwdown. We're also on iTunes, Podomatic.com, all sorts of different places. You can leave us a review or leave us a comment. Let us know what you think of the podcast. We always love hearing feedback from the fans. So thank all you out there for listening to us. And thank you, Dad, for joining me for this special episode of College Football Throwdown. We'll be coming to you with another one talking about Nebraska and the upcoming Illinois game. So until then, go Big Red.
Go Big Red.